Our family suffered a tragedy in 1999, and my two daughters were brutally attacked in our home separately by a young man who was stalking my 16-year-old daughter, Stacy. He wanted to date Stacy, and she had refused him. He took that personally and decided if he couldn't have her, no one could. And the morning that this happened, it started off as a normal morning. I went to work, typical day. I remember talking to Stacy around noon that day. She got home early from exams. She was going to work early. She just started her first job. Everything was great. And then suddenly I got a call from a police officer asking me to come home. Never giving me any indication anything was wrong. He just said, I need you to come home. Only to arrive home to find that my house was a crime scene. I was interrogated for about 2 hours. Unbeknownst to me, Christy was in the hospital fighting for her life. And when we finally got to the hospital, it was around 9:30 that evening. The call that I got was around 5, so there was a 4.5 hour time difference there. When we finally got to the hospital, I was told that Christy was not a patient there. I had no clue what was going on. I just knew that I had to find Christy. When I finally got to her, it was 11 o'clock that night, only to learn of the circumstances that Stacy had been murdered, and Christy was fighting for her life and probably wouldn't survive. And if she did survive, she might not ever walk or talk again. And then they told me all the details that had happened. Stacy was stabbed in the chest, piercing her heart in 2 places. Christy was sexually assaulted, strangled, stabbed. Both were wrist cut and her throat slashed repeatedly and left for dead. But they told us later that her esophagus and vocal cords they thought had been severed, so she would never talk again if she did survive, and that her spinal cord had been severed in 2 places from the stab wounds in her abdomen, so she would not likely never walk again. So she was in on Friday, and the following Friday she was released, walking and talking with no disabilities, and the doctors were astounded. She had 60 stitches in her neck. She had 25 staples in her stomach from where they opened her abdomen to find out what vital organs had been damaged. The spinal cord was never touched. The only vital organ that was damaged was the small intestine, which took 3 stitches. But 25 staples still were up. And that following Saturday, we buried Stacy, so we had to say goodbye. And for a whole year, I was in total shock. I don't remember much of what happened or transpired. It was second to second, and it gradually became moment to moment, and then day to day, week to week, month to month. By the grace of God, my fiance, who I was engaged to at that time, came home and found the girls and called 911, but he immediately became a suspect. And then I later became a suspect. So going through that I felt like I was drowning. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't speak, I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I couldn't function. So the young man that attacked the girls, Paul Powell, he was a 20-year-old young man. His dad, I believe, was an alcoholic. Paul was the middle child. He had a younger brother and an older brother. But Paul became involved in occults, satanic worship. We found out at the first trial that he was a white supremacist, self-proclaimed. He was a self-proclaimed member of the KKK. He was always stealing. He'd spent a stint in jail for contributing to a minor and writing hot checks. And then when he got arrested, he started confessing to all these burglaries he had been doing. But nothing to the extent of what he did to the girls. And they really didn't know what pushed him over the edge. It's just that being denied, I guess. I don't know. The trial was difficult. I met with the attorneys prior to us going to trial to kind of find out what the process would be, because having never gone through a trial, I had no idea what to expect. I'd never been in a courtroom. I'd never been through anything so horrific in my life. Going through the trial was walking through it all over again, but with a lot more knowledge. A lot more knowledge I didn't want. They told me that they would be showing pictures of the girls, the attacks. And when we got into the trial, the first trial, they showed me pictures of Stacy's autopsy that just about did me in. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was horrific. And then to sit there and listen to Christy's testimony of step by step of what he had done and how he had done it. It put me into a spiraling, deep depression that I almost couldn't climb out of. And even with my faith in the Lord's help, it just was so overwhelming, so overbearing, and so detrimental that I didn't think I could continue to be a good mom to Christy. I had failed both of my daughters. At the point when they needed me the most, I wasn't there. And so for 7 years, I dealt with a deep depression. And it was a journey that I would not want anybody to walk. It was very dark. It was very painful, excruciating to the fact that some days I couldn't even get out of bed. I didn't want to get out of bed. I wanted to climb under that rock and not ever exist again. And then I kept thinking, if I do that, then I'm giving it to him. I can't let him win. And I began to try to pull myself out of it. And the Bible was the only place I could go to find the answers. So one of the young men that hung out at my house was Sean. He was African American. He was like one of my kids. And had dinner at my table, went on family field trips, just like all the other kids did. Sean was no different. But yet Paul became very jealous of Sean, and mainly because he was African American, from what I understand. How I felt about Paul and how he violated my daughters, I didn't know I could hate somebody as much as I hated him. I didn't know this person. And yet he's come into my home and basically told us who my girls can be friends with, how we're supposed to live, and that made no sense to me. But every time I would hear something about him, it would just the heat would just rise from my toes to my head, and I just wanted to just choke him. And I thought, if I'm capable of that, what else am I capable of? But these were the emotions he would bring out in me, and it's like, I don't know this person anymore. Who am I becoming? And it scared me. It really scared me. So Paul sent me a letter to my house, giving great detail of what he had done to S.T.A.C.I and why, and what he had done to Christy. He mocked us. He thought that he was off the hook for the death penalty, so he was confessing everything, thinking, well, since you can't do to me what you wanted to do to me, I'm going to tell you what really happened. Not realizing that he was signing his own death warrant once again. Even though it played in our favor, it was extremely hard to read because it took me back to those very first hours of finding out that S.T.A.C.I had been murdered and Christy had been tragically beaten and abused and assaulted. It was devastating. I wanted to kill him even more. I wanted him to feel what I felt. I wanted him to feel what Christy felt. I wanted him to hurt so much more than what we were hurting. The hatred I had for him affected me in many, many ways. I couldn't function. I would get angry at the littlest thing. I would explode, especially driving when somebody cut you off. I felt so violated to the point that I didn't even know who I was anymore. I kept thinking, why can't I control these emotions? It's like they consumed me, they took over. And I didn't know how to unravel all that. I didn't know how to express myself without being angry or screaming, or I didn't know who I was anymore. I was in a prison of depression, anger, trapped, no way out. It felt like I was in a coffin and he was putting the last nail in. I felt destitute. I just felt isolated. Nobody understood. I didn't even understand my own anger. I didn't understand the imprisonment that I felt. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do this to myself. I didn't create this mess. He did. Why was I suffering? The anger and the depression and the hatred I had for him was overwhelming. I felt like I was in that cell right there with him, but yet I couldn't get my hands on him. The years after the attack for Christy were very detrimental. Having lost her best friend, her only sister, her only sibling, she withdrew even more. She was already a very strong introvert, but she withdrew even more. And she tried to get involved in activities like softball and gymnastics, but she just couldn't. She just couldn't find herself. She was so lost. I didn't know how to help her. And she eventually turned to drugs and alcohol, and it just almost devoured her. The depression, the anger, the guilt, the survivor's guilt that she was struggling with. I had no idea. I had no idea that she was so caught up in the fact that S.T.A.C.I died, and yet she should have lived, and Christy should have been the one that died. That's was Christy's mentality. Christy's life turned around when she got arrested in 2012, and the arresting officer knew who she was, thank God. He took her directly to the magistrate instead of the jail, and she was standing before the magistrate, and the magistrate said, I know who you are. I know what you've been through, and you have one opportunity to get your life together. I don't ever want to see you back in this office again. And she ordered Christy into rehab. She got through rehab, got clean, and has never looked back. But one of the amazing things that happened after that was that she met a young man named Jason. They met, started dating, and he was with her through the rehab. And she told him, she said, if you're not here when I get out, then I'll know you really don't care. And he was. And he's still there. The doctors had told Christy when she was in the hospital that she would likely never have children if she did survive, because the sexual assault was so abusive. And in 2014, she called me and she said, Mom, are you sitting down? And I said, what's the matter? She says, are you sitting down? I said, what's the matter? She says, I'm pregnant. Well, in November of 14, we have a baby granddaughter. In 2015, she called me and she said, are you sitting down? And I said, what's the matter with the baby? She said, nothing's wrong with the baby. I'm pregnant. So Cassie was only 6 months old. So we have a grandson. They're 15 months apart. And now she's having her third child. So I know that God's given us miracles. I know who He is. I know what He's done. I'm seeing it. And the blessings are just enormous. In 2007, I was released from the guilt of surviving. I was released from the guilt and bondage of hatred and anger. I was released from the bondage of depression because I was able to finally learn how to surrender all that to the Lord. And it wasn't easy to surrender it. I didn't want to let go of it because that was what became comfortable to me. If I could hang on to that, then I could probably survive. And that's all I needed to really do was survive. I didn't think there was anything more that the Lord could do for me or that He could use me in any way because I was broken. So He taught me how to surrender. And when I finally was able to let go of it, I knew then I was going to be okay, but I didn't really think He could use me. Well, then a few months later, He said, He kept saying this one word, forgiveness. And it began to irritate me. It's like, why do I keep hearing this word, forgiveness? And the Lord said, because there's somebody that you need to forgive. And then it hit me. It was like, you want me to forgive Paul Powell? Said, yeah. I'm like, no, not happening. He doesn't deserve it. And I argued that for months, which turned into years. And I argued and I argued. No, he does not deserve my forgiveness, nor will he ever get it. And finally, one day the Lord said, and you deserve mine. And that was the breaking point. It's like, wow, I put myself on a pedestal that I am so much better than everybody else and that I can do this without Him being the Lord. And it's like, I can't. I know I can't. So I asked the Lord, I said, show me how, because I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know how to do that. I don't know how to offer Him forgiveness because right now I still hate Him. until he began putting people in my path that had found forgiveness of something as horrific as I was experiencing. But I still wasn't buying it. It can't be that easy. And it wasn't. And so then I realized that I need to ask the Lord to change this heart of stone, because that's what it's become. And there's still a lot of hatred there that I need to work through, and a lot of anger, and a lot of self-anger and guilt that I was still struggling with. And I knew in my mind that forgiveness was going to set me free, but just coming to that point was hard. It was a very hard journey to walk. I didn't feel like he was worthy of that. And yet the Lord reminded me that I wasn't either. He died for me so that I could be worthy, so that I could have grace and mercy. I began to realize he did the same for Paul. So the forgiveness of Paul was a huge turning point in my life, setting me free from that bondage of all that darkness. So I worked through that, and finally on January 29th, 2008, which was 9 years to the day of the attacks, I was able to forgive Paul. And again, the release, the amazing feeling of his presence, being in the presence of the Lord, was amazing. I wish I could just share that with people, because it's just incredible to know that you've been released from such a strong bondage. After I was able to finally forgive Paul, the Lord asked me to write a letter to him, and I said, no, he doesn't need to know. That's between me and you, and I want to keep it that way. But the Lord was adamant that for some reason Paul needed to know that I had forgiven him, and I battled with that. I finally sat down months later and wrote the letter, and it stayed on my desk for another few months. And the Lord said, you need to mail that letter. And I said, no, I don't need to mail the letter. I don't want to mail the letter. And, we try to put God in a box and conform him to our ways and what we think is best for us, knowing full well he knows better than we do. He created us. But yet I didn't want to give in to that, letting that letter go, because it was personal to me. And again, it felt like if I sent it to him, I was letting go of another tangible thing that I could hold on to. Eventually, I finally wound up mailing the letter, and when I got to the mailbox, I would sit it on the lid and not let it go. That day, I finally let it go and almost dove in after it. I think I was afraid of what I would find at the other end of that letter. But the significance of that letter, I didn't realize until months later, that God was asking me to let go so he could work further, not only in my life, but in Paul's life. The day before Paul's execution, we had a phone conference with him at his attorney's office. I'd wanted to meet face to face, but that just wasn't, I guess, meant to be. And then during that phone conversation, I went into it with the mindset that I was going to get answers to questions that I had for the past 11 years that only he could answer. But what God did in that phone conference was completely, totally different than what I expected. During that phone conference, he shared with us, in his own words, what he had done and why he had done it, and finding out that he didn't care about himself. Why would he care about anybody else? And being rejected by a 16-year-old girl was just the most devastating thing that had happened to him, evidently. And so he took that rage and took it out on Stacy. But then when he didn't get what he wanted from Stacy, he took it out on Christy. Once I was able to tell him from my own lips to his ears that I had forgiven him, the whole conversation shifted. And when I said that to him, he said, I don't deserve your forgiveness, and he started crying. The second part of the conversation, I remember saying to him, You know I forgave you, but I haven't heard you tell me you've forgiven yourself. And he got very frustrated and he said, no, I can't forgive myself for what I did to you. And he started crying. 2 years prior to this conversation we were having with him, I had learned that he'd become a Christian. But I was doubting it. But I understood at that point God was showing me. And I asked him, I said, is he showing me the truth? Has he truly accepted you as his Christ and Savior? And he said, yes, he has. In that moment, and I remember saying to him, I hope that you can find the peace that I have and find that forgiveness of yourself. Just as I am, you are a child of God as well. And I remember saying to him that when you get to heaven, S.T.A.C.I will be there to welcome you home. And I'll see you when I get there. And the call ended. We were no longer in any contact with him whatsoever. So the night of Paul's execution, we arrive at the prison. We're standing outside a metal building, which was a death chamber. There was nothing significant about it except that it held another part of our journey. And when I got to the point of walking through that door, I was like rooted to the ground. I could feel the electricity in the air. The stench was horrible. It was cold. It was dark, and the building was extremely dark inside. The door was open, and I could see into this dark. I could just see into the darkness. And I finally walked through the door, and as I did, it was just pitch black. And I remember the metal door slamming behind us, and it just jolted me into a realization that this is probably going to happen. This is where we are now. And it terrified me because I knew what we were facing. I knew what he was facing. And I'm in this dark room. It's pitch black, and I finally see what looks like light filtering through the blinds of a window. So I made my way over there to the window, and as I'm standing there anticipating the next moment, the blinds begin to open, and I see before me a white stark room, and off to the right is a solitary wooden chair with a clock above it. And my focus stayed on that chair, and then I heard voices, and the assistant warden was behind me. He said they were reading him his last rites. The chaplain is with him. They're going to be bringing him out shortly. And finally I hear chains rattling, and Paul comes into view with several guards around him. His feet are shackled, his wrists are shackled. He's in a blue button-down shirt, his head shaved. He's in blue cotton pants with the left leg cut off at the knee, and he's got rubber flip-flops on. He goes over to the chair, and he's standing in front of it, but his eyes are diverted toward us. I remember them taking the shackles off of him and strapping him into the chair, but yet his eyes never left us. But the peace that he emitted, and just the peace that he had in his body language, was just amazing to me, because I knew Christ was with him. I knew Paul was okay. And as they were strapping him in the chair, they finally put the mask over his face, but yet his face never turned away from us. And then he was executed. The next day, we're driving home, and his attorney calls us, and he said, Lorraine, how are you doing? And I thought, I don't know. I can't put words to what my emotions are right now. And he says, well, I spent all day with Paul, and his family came to see him. They could come from 9 to 3 and spend some time with him, and it was his mom and his older brother. And all he kept saying to his mom was, they forgave me. They forgave me. And he just cried. I think they cried together. And then his attorney said, he has one more thing he wants you to know, but he wanted me to wait until today to tell you. And I thought, here it comes. Now, after all this time, what is his last words going to be? And his attorney said, Paul said to tell you, he forgave himself. The S.T.A.C.I.E Foundation was founded in 2001 after the attack of the girls as a way to give a voice to the voiceless, to victims who were silenced. And because Paul tried to silence Stacy's voice, I became Stacy's voice. And I wanted victims to have a voice. In doing so, we were able to change policies and procedures within law enforcement agencies on how they dealt with victims. And I wanted to educate them also on the impact of victimization that we were left to deal with. Their focus is the offender. They also needed to focus on us. And I felt like we were left behind in several instances. So we were able to change a lot of policies and procedures across the United States. The foundation really gave a lot of focus to victim advocacy, and we were able to help a lot of other victims going through similar situations that we have gone through. And then in 2010, God kind of changed our direction, and after the execution, I was asked to speak in a prison. It was there that I discovered that there are a lot of victims in prison, victims of somebody or something, and there's a lot of broken people, but they also needed to know who God was, who God is, and what God's doing, and how God can change their lives, and that forgiveness is powerful. And I've seen many offenders who've come up to me and said, your story completely changed my life. And I said, but you need to understand, it wasn't me, it was Christ. Only He could do that. In March 2018, my book, Heal My Wounds, Leave My Scars, was published. This tells the story of our journey from my perspective. But I hope that it brings healing and hope to other victims and also offenders, because Christ loves us all no matter what we've done, no matter who we are. And through this story, we hope that we can share what forgiveness looks like for others. And here we are 20 years later. And I just still can't wrap my mind around everything that God's done and is doing in our lives through the ministry. He's touching people that I would never have dreamed He could touch. He's sending me to places I never thought I would ever go. It's just been phenomenal.